I think in a lot of ways, it's the album that they've needed to make for a long time, because suddenly it adds a sense of completeness to the catalog, all the influences being brought together. Hello, my name is Ian Beabout, and welcome to my YouTube channel. So today, I would like to talk about the newly released studio album from Opeth. This is The Last Will and Testament. Now, as you can see here, I have the 2-disc version, which contains stereo mixes as well as the Dolby Atmos mix. The Blu-ray is currently in my Blu-ray player, so that's why it's not present. But this is one of the many iterations of this release that are available to you. There is also a single disc version that just has the album. And I believe there are 2 vinyl variants. There's also a big, expensive box set that has everything in it. Right from the top of this review, I would like to thank those who made these choices. I don't know if this is the band or the record label, but I would like to thank them for including the Atmos mix in a reasonably priced release. The 1 CD and 1 Blu-ray edition is only about $20. Which is about $5 more than the single disc version, which I think makes it a no-brainer to pick this version up, especially if you are a multi-channel enthusiast as I am. So you see included is this fold-out poster type thing, which contains a number of the album's lyrics, but they aren't necessarily sung in all the right order, which is interesting. It makes me think that maybe the lyrics were prepared prior to the actual album being recorded, and maybe some things were tweaked in the studio, but I digress. I've been an Opeth fan for, maybe about 10 years. I first jumped on board with Heritage, famously the album where Michael Ackerfeld stopped growling, the guttural vocal style that characterizes a lot of death metal. In terms of Opeth releases, this wasn't the first time that he had abandoned the growls completely, but it was the first time that he did for an album that was essentially still a rock album, because Damnation was more of a folky, kind of Camel-esque thing. Heritage was an album that was unapologetically a rock and roll album, albeit a progressive rock album. And that was a case where he did not growl at all, but the music still had that power. So this is the first album since 2011 in which Michael has reintroduced the growls. That's not the only change on this album. Opeth have maintained a steady lineup, more or less, since Heritage, but they have replaced the drummer on this album. The drummer is relatively young. He's about 30 years old, which is about my age. So he's younger than the band, and it gives this album a bit more urgency to me. I think the drumming on it is very, very strong throughout, and it definitely seems to have inspired Michael and the other members of the band. This is a concept album, and it plays through like a single unbroken track, much like albums like A Passion Play by Jethro Tull or Thick as a Brick. In fact, that's often what I thought of when listening to this album was those 2 albums by Jethro Tull. Now, this concept is fascinating. It deals with the death of a patriarch. The father has passed away and left a will behind, and now all of the suspected secrets that have existed within this family have come to light. The truth has come out, and those who are who stand to benefit from the will are dealing with a lot of infighting and backstabbing. You know, he was my favorite, I deserve this, that sort of thing. And at the center of this album, you have the voice of the patriarch himself, played by none other than Ian Anderson, who provides a ghostly and kind of dark presence throughout the whole album, as his voice is literally being read off of the will. And I find this a fascinating choice in a lot of ways, especially being that I'm a huge Jethro Tull fan, and I've always kind of seen Ian Anderson as this slightly controversial patriarch figure. Among the band itself, there has been quite a lot of controversy, and his decisions are not always received warmly by the other members of the band. So I feel like this choice to cast Ian Anderson in this role couldn't be more perfect and is very inspired. And his position in the album is such that it never feels like he's holding it up. It feels like he's a very important part of it, but that's all he is he's just a part of the album. It still feels like, despite the presence of him, and there's another person who's involved with the band Europe who appears on one track. Both of these roles are there to hold up what Opeth is already doing. I feel like this is very much still Opeth's album. Even in the middle of the album where we have just a little bit of flute from Ian Anderson in kind of a transitional passage that erupts into a great guitar solo. So he never feels to me like it's, oh, look at our special guest, Ian Anderson. It feels integrated into the concept very organically. So how do I feel about this album? With this album, I feel like you have all of the ingredients of previous Opeth. You have the heavy death metal textures. You have the more subdued folky moments where Michael gets to sing more. You have the outstanding guitar work, drumming and keyboards. Everything on this album, I think, has had some sort of representation in the catalog before, but it's the first time that all of these influences have melded together in a way that it just kind of feels like a culmination of everything that the band has done over the past 30 years. And at the same time, it also feels like something completely new. There's also a documentary included in the on the Blu-ray, and Michael makes a comment that he was making this album in the spirit of the TikTok generation. And you can kind of hear that because most Opeth albums up until this point, in my opinion, have been more like stoner rock in a way. Like they kind of remind me of bands like Black Sabbath or Rainbow, or even later artists like Sleep, where you have this kind of very chugging groove-based music. And that's not necessarily the case with this album. This album is more frenetic. It's more like Mr. Bungle almost, although it's like very distinctly still Opeth. But to me, this is kind of a new idea to have things change so much. It never gets boring. There's never a moment on this record where I feel like it's overstaying its welcome, because there'll be something really fascinating happen and then the texture will change completely, but it's still compelling. And it still has that Opeth signature where things don't feel disjointed to me. It still flows very successfully. And it's really not until the last track that the record has a chance to take a breather. And the last song is one of the prettiest things on the record. And when I first started listening to this album, I didn't like the last song. I didn't feel like it fit, or I felt like Opeth had done stuff like that but better in the past. But I noticed over a couple of listens that last track started to really grow on me. I also feel like this album is going to be a great entry point for people who, like me, did come on around the Heritage period. And I think that it may even help a lot of those folks get into some of the older, more death metal oriented records, simply because I feel like the death metal growls are used so sparingly. And it's only in parts of the album where I feel like they need to be there. Oftentimes, there's moments where Michael is having like a call and response. You'll hear a growl, and then you'll hear clean vocals kind of backing it up. And there's one in particular, I think it's around part 5, where the band, the bass and drums, are really chugging ahead in like this heavy, like metal style. And you've got acoustic guitar over top of it, power chording, and orchestra at the same time as Michael is growling, and there's some clean, kind of folky, clean vocals supporting it. And I just have to think, what else sounds like this? Which you have here in these orchestrations from Dave Stewart. And I am talking about the Canterbury Scene guy, not the Eurythmics guy. But what you have here in the orchestrations from Dave Stewart is something that doesn't simply double what's already being performed by the band, but rather it feels like it adds something to the fullness of the arrangements. And oftentimes you'll hear guitar and orchestra at the same time, and the guitar is simply there to just fill out what the orchestra is doing. I think in a lot of ways it's the album that they've needed to make for a long time, because suddenly it adds a sense of completeness to the catalog, all the influences being brought together. And I think this is a special album. It's a special band. This is a band who've been around for 30 years, and they should be on the decline. And it seems like they continue to come up with stuff that's fresh and interesting, but is still uniquely them. So I have talked about the many things that I love about this record, and there's really not much to criticize. I would like to talk briefly about the Dolby Atmos mix, because there is one included, which I'm very grateful for. I'm grateful that there's always been an attempt to bring Opeth's music in multi-channel. Some more successful than others, some less available than others. But it seems like Michael is interested in the format enough to keep it going, or at least there's fan interest enough in the format to keep it going. This is the first Opeth album to be presented in Dolby Atmos, which is cool. I'm glad that they went to the effort to do that. And I did have a chance to listen to both the stereo mix all the way through and the Atmos mix a couple of times. And both of them sound fantastic. The stereo mix is pretty quiet. It's fairly dynamic. Maybe not as dynamic as the Atmos mix, but the dynamics are there. And there's never a sense that it's like brick-walled or overcompressed or anything of that sort. That being said, I do prefer the Atmos mix on the whole, because it does seem like it's a little more separated. You can hear more detail of the parts. If there's one thing that maybe I might criticize with the Atmos mix, it's that sometimes the guitars are maybe a little low in the mix, especially in relation to the drums. It's not necessarily the most immersive mix in the world, with a lot of the guitar, bass, and drums being up front, and the heights and rear speakers mostly being reserved for a lot of vocal effects, sound effects. You'll hear keyboards bouncing around sometimes in the back, or some kind of slapback echo effect happening. But for the most part, the Atmos mix really just serves to open it up, make it more transparent so you can hear more of what's going on. It's not necessarily the most immersive. And I've noticed this is a pattern with the Opeth mixes. A lot of them are quite front heavy, but they still they're still clear. It still retains the power. So I'm not going to complain too much. Now, this isn't the case for the two surround mixes that Steven Wilson did, because his work on Heritage and Pale Communion is fantastic. But I do digress. I think that this is one of the better non-Wilson multi-channel mixes, but I would say don't expect this to be something like Heritage or Pale Communion. It's more in line with some of their older surround mixes like Watershed, perhaps. So just with that in mind, I do think that it is an excellent way to enjoy the album, and I think it is in many ways superior to the stereo mix, although I do think the guitars are a little more prominent in the stereo mix. Other than that, I really have nothing but positive things to say about this mix, both mixes. I think that this is a great album. It's maybe the most exciting Opeth album in some time. I do highly recommend it. I think that if you have an interest in progressive music, even if you're not the biggest fan of the growls, I think there's something here for you. And it might just open up some of those older Opeth records for you, which I think is a cool thing for this to do. It's almost like it's bringing the new fans to the older material and the old fans to the newer material. And I commend Michael and the band for their work here. I did mention that the orchestra is a huge part of this album, so much so that I feel like if they play this live, they should do a DVD set. They should do a full recording of this album with an orchestra and release it as one piece. I think that would be phenomenal. And then perhaps even in the second half of the concert, they could go back and do older songs with an orchestra. I think that would be such a wonderful idea. Definitely check this album out, The Last Will and Testament by Opeth. Don't forget that if you enjoyed watching this, please do subscribe to the channel. Very soon, I will be taking a look at the Jethro Tull Christmas album Atmos Mix, and that box set that's coming out early December. So if you want to hear me talk about that, please do subscribe. And don't forget to let me know your thoughts on The Last Will and Testament in the comments section below. All right, thank you so much for joining me. It's been fun. See you next time. Bye-bye.